Single dad janitor yelled, "Don't get in the car." What the CEO did next shocked the whole company. The afternoon sun was beating down on the glass windows of Morrison Enterprises when Marcus Thompson pushed his cleaning cart out of the service entrance, his gray janitor uniform already damp with sweat from 8 hours of mopping floors and emptying trash bins in the 40-story building that housed one of the city's most powerful companies. Marcus wasn't supposed to be outside at 3 in the afternoon because his shift didn't end until 6, but something had made him rush out of the building, something that had turned his blood to ice when he'd seen those papers in the executive conference room trash bin 20 minutes ago. His daughter Emma was waiting for him at home, probably doing her homework at the kitchen table where she always sat with her colored pencils spread out like a rainbow, drawing pictures of butterflies and flowers while her grandmother watched her favorite cooking show on their old television that only got 3 channels clearly. Emma was 9 years old and the only light in Marcus's life since his wife Sarah had died in that terrible accident 2 years ago, leaving him to raise their daughter alone while working nights and weekends to pay for the medical bills that still came in the mail every month like clockwork. The papers he'd found weren't meant for his eyes, they were shredded documents that someone had carelessly thrown away without making sure they were completely destroyed, and Marcus had only noticed them because one piece had fallen on the floor when he was emptying the bin. He'd picked it up to throw it away properly when he saw the words that made his heart stop: Project Elimination, Target, Victoria Sterling, Execute, Today 3:30 p.m., Method, Vehicle Malfunction. Victoria Sterling was the CEO of Morrison Enterprises, a woman Marcus had only seen from a distance as she walked through the lobby each morning in her expensive suits and high heels, always surrounded by security guards and assistants who treated her like royalty. Marcus had worked at the building for 5 years, invisible to everyone except the other janitors and maintenance workers who understood what it was like to clean up after people who never even looked at you, but today he couldn't be invisible because he knew something terrible was about to happen. As Marcus burst through the service door, he saw the sleek black Mercedes parked at the curb where it always waited for Ms. Sterling, the driver standing beside it checking his phone while 2 security guards in dark suits scanned the street with the practiced eyes of professionals who had been trained to spot danger from 100 yards away. Marcus's mind was racing as he tried to figure out what to do because he knew nobody would believe a janitor who claimed he'd found evidence of an assassination plot in the trash, especially when that evidence was just fragments of paper that could mean anything to someone who hadn't spent the last 20 minutes piecing them together like a horrible puzzle. He thought about calling the police but knew they would need more proof than his word, and by the time they arrived it would be too late because the digital clock on the bank across the street showed 3:25 p.m., giving him only 5 minutes before whatever was planned would happen. That's when he saw her, Victoria Sterling herself, walking out of the building's main entrance with her phone pressed to her ear, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the wind that was picking up, carrying the smell of rain that would probably start falling soon. She was walking toward the car with the confident stride of someone who had never had a reason to be afraid, someone who didn't know that in less than 5 minutes her life was supposed to end according to the terrible plan Marcus had discovered. The security guards moved into position as she approached, one of them already reaching for the door handle of the Mercedes, and Marcus knew he had to act now or live with the guilt forever. Without thinking about the consequences, without considering that he might lose his job or be arrested or worse, Marcus started running toward the car, his work boots slapping against the concrete as he shouted the words that would change everything: "Ma'am, don't get in the car. Please, don't get in that car." The security guards reacted instantly, moving like trained soldiers to intercept him, and Marcus felt strong hands grab his arms and slam him against the limestone wall of the building hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. "Don't let her get in," Marcus gasped, struggling against the guards who held him. "Please, you can't let her get in that car, something's wrong with it." Victoria Sterling stood frozen with her hand on the chrome door handle, her steel-gray eyes fixed on Marcus with a mixture of surprise and something else, maybe recognition of the genuine terror in his voice that couldn't be faked. "Stand down," she said to her security guards, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Who are you and what do you know?" Marcus tried to catch his breath, very aware that everyone was staring at him, including a crowd of people who had stopped on the sidewalk to watch the drama unfold. "My name is Marcus Thompson, I work maintenance in your building, night shift usually but I was covering for someone today," he said quickly, knowing he had maybe 30 seconds to convince her before the guards dragged him away. "I found papers in the trash, shredded documents that weren't completely destroyed. They mentioned your name and this car and the time 3:30 p.m. and something about vehicle malfunction as a method." The head of security, a massive man named Rodriguez whom Marcus had seen around the building for years, stepped forward with his hand inside his jacket where Marcus knew he kept his weapon. "Ms. Sterling, we should get you inside immediately while we investigate this claim," Rodriguez said, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "This could be a distraction for something else." Victoria looked at her watch, then at the car, then back at Marcus who was still pressed against the wall but no longer struggling because he'd said what he needed to say and now it was up to them to believe him or not. "Search the vehicle," she ordered, and Rodriguez immediately began barking orders into his radio while pulling Victoria back toward the building entrance. Within minutes, the street was full of police cars with their lights flashing, and a bomb squad truck pulled up with technicians in heavy protective gear who began examining every inch of the Mercedes while everyone was moved back behind yellow tape that seemed to appear from nowhere. Marcus found himself sitting on the curb with his hands cuffed behind his back while a detective asked him questions about exactly what he'd seen and where the papers were now, and he tried to explain about piecing together the shredded documents in the conference room trash bin but could see the skepticism in the detective's eyes. An hour passed, then two, and Marcus watched the sun move across the sky while thinking about Emma waiting for him at home, probably worried because he always called her after school to make sure she'd gotten home safely but his phone was in his locker and the police wouldn't let him use it. The bomb squad had taken the car apart piece by piece, and Marcus heard one of them telling Rodriguez that they'd found something suspicious in the brake system, some kind of device that would have caused catastrophic failure at high speed, making it look like an accident. The detective who had been questioning Marcus suddenly looked at him differently, not like a crazy person or a troublemaker but like someone who had just saved a life, and the handcuffs were removed so quickly that Marcus barely had time to realize what was happening before Victoria Sterling herself was standing in front of him. "They found evidence of tampering," she said simply, her voice steady but her eyes showing the shock of someone who had just realized how close they'd come to death. The device was sophisticated, professional work that would have been almost impossible to detect without specifically looking for it. Marcus rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had left red marks, not sure what to say because he was just a janitor who had been in the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place depending on how you looked at it. "I have a daughter," he said finally, not sure why he was telling her this except that it seemed important somehow. "Her name is Emma, she's 9. And when I saw those papers all I could think about was how she would feel if something happened to someone when I could have prevented it." Victoria studied him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression, a softening that made her look less like the untouchable CEO and more like a regular person who had just been reminded of her mortality. "You risked everything to warn someone you don't even know," she said. "You could have lost your job, been arrested, or worse if the people behind this had been watching." Marcus shrugged because he hadn't really thought about it that way, he'd just acted on instinct like when Emma had almost walked into traffic once and he'd grabbed her without thinking about the car that nearly hit him in the process. "Mr. Thompson," Victoria said, and it was strange hearing his actual name from someone so important. "I need to know everything you remember about those documents, every detail no matter how small, because someone in my company tried to have me killed and I need to find out who." So Marcus told her everything, about finding the first piece of paper on the floor, about carefully collecting all the shredded strips from the bin, about sitting in the supply closet and piecing them together like the puzzles Emma loved to do on rainy weekends. He told her about the project name Elimination and the code words he'd seen, about the reference to a wire transfer of $5 million and a bank account in the Cayman Islands, about the signature at the bottom that had been mostly destroyed but showed what looked like the letters, RB, which could have been anyone but made Victoria's face go pale. "Robert Blackwood," she whispered, and Marcus could see the betrayal in her eyes because from her reaction this wasn't just anyone, this was someone she had trusted. "He's my CFO, been with the company for 15 years, I promoted him myself last year." Rodriguez stepped forward, already pulling out his phone to make calls, but Victoria held up her hand to stop him. "No, if we move too quickly he'll disappear and we'll never get the proof we need to convict him," she said, her mind clearly working through the implications. We need to be smart about this, need to gather evidence before he realizes we know. She turned back to Marcus, who was feeling very out of place in this conversation about corporate espionage and attempted murder. Mr. Thompson, I need your help because you're the only person I can trust right now who isn't part of the company hierarchy, the only one who couldn't possibly be involved in this conspiracy. Marcus thought about Emma again, about how he needed his job to keep paying for their apartment and her school supplies and the medicine for her asthma that cost more than he made in a week. I can't lose my job, Miss Sterling, I have responsibilities, he said, hating how desperate he sounded but needing her to understand. Victoria smiled for the first time since Marcus had seen her, a real smile that transformed her face and made her look younger despite the silver hair that he now realized she wore like armor, a sign of her experience and authority in a world that usually preferred its female CEOs young and accommodating. Mr. Thompson, you're not going to lose your job, in fact I'm promoting you to my personal security team effective immediately with a salary that will make your current pay look like pocket change, she said, and Marcus had to sit down again because his legs suddenly felt weak. But I don't know anything about security, he protested, even though part of him was already calculating how much Emma's college fund could grow with a real salary instead of the minimum wage he'd been surviving on. You know how to see things others miss, Victoria countered. You know how to piece together information that everyone else overlooks, and most importantly, you've already proven that you'll risk everything to do the right thing. Rodriguez cleared his throat, clearly not thrilled about having a janitor added to his carefully selected team, but Victoria silenced him with a look that Marcus was beginning to recognize as her way of ending discussions before they began. Rodriguez will train you, and you'll work directly with him to investigate this conspiracy because I have a feeling Robert Blackwood isn't working alone, she said. Someone had to plant that device, someone had to provide the technical expertise, and someone had to think they would benefit from my death. Over the next few hours, Marcus found himself in a situation he never could have imagined that morning when he'd kissed Emma goodbye and headed to work for what he thought would be another invisible day of cleaning up after people who didn't know he existed. He was sitting in Victoria Sterling's private office on the top floor of the building, a place he'd only seen from the outside when he was washing windows, surrounded by computers and security monitors while Rodriguez reluctantly showed him how to access the building's surveillance systems. We're looking for anything unusual in the past week, Rodriguez explained, his fingers flying over the keyboard with surprising speed for such large hands. Anyone accessing floors they shouldn't, meetings that weren't on the calendar, documents being removed from the building without authorization. Marcus found himself good at this kind of investigation, maybe because he'd spent years noticing the small things that other people ignored, like which executive always worked late on Thursdays not because of dedication but because he was having an affair with his secretary, or which manager was stealing office supplies by the box load and selling them online. He'd never said anything about these observations because it wasn't his job and he couldn't afford to make enemies, but now Victoria wanted him to use these skills to find out who wanted her dead and why. As they reviewed the security footage, Marcus noticed something that made him sit up straighter in the leather chair that probably cost more than his car. There, he said, pointing at the screen where a figure in a maintenance uniform was entering the parking garage at 2 a.m. 3 nights ago. That's not one of our people, I know everyone on the night maintenance crew and that's not any of them. Rodriguez zoomed in on the image, enhancing it until they could see the man's face clearly, and Victoria gasped because she recognized him too. That's James Mitchell from Apex Corporation, she said, naming Morrison Enterprises' biggest competitor. He's their head of special operations, which is a fancy way of saying corporate spy. The pieces were starting to come together like one of Emma's puzzles, and Marcus could see the picture forming even though some parts were still missing. So Robert Blackwood was going to sell out to Apex after you were gone, he asked, trying to understand the corporate politics that were as foreign to him as another language. More than that, Victoria said, her voice hard with anger. With me dead and Robert as CFO, he would have been in position to take over as CEO, then he could have engineered a merger that would have made him and James Mitchell very rich while destroying everything I've built over the past 20 years. Marcus thought about all the people who worked in the building, not just the executives but the secretaries and security guards and yes, the janitors too, all of whom would probably lose their jobs if the company was sold to Apex, which had a reputation for cutting costs by firing half the workforce whenever they acquired a new company. "We need more proof," Rodriguez said, still working at the computer. "The security footage shows Mitchell entering the building but not what he did once he was inside, and without concrete evidence linking him to the car tampering, he'll claim he was here for legitimate business." That's when Marcus remembered something else he'd seen while cleaning, something that hadn't seemed important at the time but now might be crucial. "The conference room on the 35th floor," he said suddenly. "I cleaned it last night after a late meeting, and there were coffee cups for 3 people but the sign-in sheet only showed 2 names, Robert Blackwood and someone from accounting." Victoria and Rodriguez exchanged glances, and Marcus could tell he'd found something significant even if he didn't fully understand what it meant. "That's the conference room where our most sensitive financial documents are kept in a secure filing system," Victoria explained. "If there was a third person there who didn't sign in, they were trying to hide their presence." Rodriguez was already pulling up the footage from that floor, and sure enough, there was James Mitchell again, slipping into the conference room after the official meeting had ended and the accounting person had left. They watched as Mitchell and Blackwood spent 2 hours going through files, taking pictures with their phones, and occasionally laughing like they were sharing a private joke about how clever they were. "We've got them," Rodriguez said with satisfaction, already sending the footage to his security team with instructions to locate both men immediately. But Victoria was looking at something else on the screen, a timestamp that showed the meeting had ended at 11:47 p.m., and her face had gone pale again. "Marcus, you said you cleaned that room last night?" she asked, and when he nodded, she continued in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "They would have known you were coming. The cleaning schedule is posted on the internal network, which means they knew you might find something." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what she was implying, that Blackwood and Mitchell hadn't just been careless with the shredded documents, they had left them there on purpose, knowing a janitor would find them and probably throw them away properly without looking too closely. "They were counting on me not caring," he said slowly. "They figured a janitor wouldn't piece together shredded documents or risk their job to warn someone they didn't know." "But they didn't count on you being you," Victoria said, and there was something like admiration in her voice. "They didn't count on Marcus Thompson, single father who works 2 jobs to take care of his daughter, who notices everything but says nothing, who would risk his livelihood to save a stranger's life." Before Marcus could respond, Rodriguez's phone rang, and his face darkened as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "Blackwood's gone," he said after hanging up. "His assistant says he left for a family emergency an hour ago, right after the bomb squad started examining the car, and Mitchell checked out of his hotel this morning and hasn't been seen since." Victoria stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city, her reflection ghost-like in the glass as the sun began to set. "They're running," she said. "They know we're onto them and they're trying to disappear before we can build a case." Marcus thought about the $5 million mentioned in the shredded documents, about how far that money could take someone who wanted to vanish, and felt frustrated that these men might escape justice after what they'd tried to do. "The Cayman Islands account," he said suddenly, remembering that detail. "The transfer was supposed to happen after your death, which means it hasn't happened yet because you're still alive." Rodriguez was already typing, pulling up financial records with the kind of access that Marcus didn't want to know how he had. "He's right," Rodriguez said after a moment. "There's a pending transfer scheduled for today at midnight, $5 million from a Morrison Enterprises subsidiary to an account in the Cayman Islands, but it requires 2 signatures and one of them has to be the CEO's." Victoria smiled again, but this time it was the smile of a predator who had just spotted prey. "Which means Robert can't complete the transfer without either my signature or proof of my death," she said. "He'll have to surface to try to get that money, and when he does, we'll be waiting." The next several hours were a blur of activity as Victoria mobilized not just her security team but also the FBI and local police, explaining the situation and providing the evidence they'd gathered. Marcus found himself giving statements to federal agents who treated him with a respect he wasn't used to, calling him, sir, and thanking him for his vigilance. As night fell, he finally got a chance to call Emma, who answered on the first ring with worry in her voice. "Daddy, where are you? Grandma said you called earlier but you sounded strange and then we saw police cars at your work on the news." Marcus didn't know how to explain everything that had happened, how to tell his 9-year-old daughter that her father had gone from being invisible to being a hero in the span of a single afternoon. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he said. "Something important came up at work but I'll be home soon and I'll explain everything, and Emma? Things are going to be different from now on, better, I promise." After he hung up, Victoria approached him with an envelope in her hand. "I know we discussed a position on my security team, but I've been thinking about it and I have a better idea," she said. "I want you to head up a new division focused on internal security and threat assessment, basically doing what you've always done but officially and with the resources to actually act on what you find." Marcus stared at the envelope, afraid to open it because he couldn't imagine what salary someone in charge of a division would make. "I don't have a degree," he said weakly. "I barely finished high school." Victoria laughed, not mockingly but with genuine warmth. "Marcus, you just saved my life and probably my company with skills they don't teach in any school," she said. "You see what others miss, you piece together puzzles that others don't even know exist, and most importantly, you act on your convictions even when it costs you everything." When Marcus finally opened the envelope and saw the number written there, he had to sit down again because it was more than he'd made in the last 5 years combined. "This is too much," he said, "but—" Victoria shook her head. "It's not enough for someone who saved my life, but it's a start," she said. "And there's full benefits including health insurance that will cover your daughter's asthma medication, education assistance if you want to get that degree, and a college fund contribution for Emma." As if the universe wanted to provide a perfect ending to this surreal day, Rodriguez's phone rang again, and this time he was smiling when he hung up. "They got them," he announced. Blackwood and Mitchell were arrested at a private airfield trying to board a plane to Costa Rica, and they had documents with them that implicate 3 other people in the conspiracy. The relief in the room was palpable, and Victoria actually hugged Marcus, a brief but genuine embrace that left him stunned because he couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him except Emma. "We make a good team," she said, stepping back but keeping her hand on his shoulder. "I've been surrounded by yes-men and corporate climbers for so long that I forgot what it was like to have someone around who just does the right thing because it's right." Marcus thought about all the nights he'd spent pushing his cart through empty hallways, invisible to everyone who passed, and realized that maybe being invisible had been a gift because it had let him see things that others couldn't or wouldn't. "Can I ask you something?" he said to Victoria, who nodded. "Why did you believe me? When I yelled at you not to get in the car, why did you listen to a janitor you'd never met?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city lights that were beginning to twinkle as darkness fell completely. "My father was a janitor," she said finally. "He worked nights at a hospital for 30 years, and he used to tell me that the people who clean up after others see the truth because they're looking at what's been discarded, what people think doesn't matter anymore." She turned back to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "He would have been proud of what you did today, standing up for what's right even when you had everything to lose." Marcus felt his own eyes burning and had to look away, thinking about Emma and how he could now give her the life she deserved, thinking about Sarah and how proud she would have been, thinking about how a regular day had become the most important day of his life. The story made the news, of course, with headlines screaming about the janitor who saved the CEO and uncovered a corporate conspiracy, but Marcus tried to stay out of the spotlight as much as possible because he didn't want Emma's life disrupted by reporters and camera crews. Victoria respected his wishes, handling the media herself and always crediting her security team, without naming names, though she made sure everyone at Morrison Enterprises knew exactly who had saved the company. Marcus's first day in his new position was awkward, with executives who had never noticed him before suddenly wanting to shake his hand and thank him, but he handled it with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through years of being invisible. He set up his new office on the 35th floor, not far from the conference room where he'd found those fateful documents, and began building a team of people like himself, observers who noticed the small things that others missed. Emma was thrilled with their new apartment in a building with a doorman and a pool, but what made her happiest was that her father was home for dinner every night now, no longer working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. She drew a picture for Victoria, a bright yellow sun shining on a tall building with two figures standing in front of it, one tall with silver hair and one in a gray uniform, holding hands. When Marcus gave it to Victoria, she had it framed and hung in her office next to her diplomas and awards, telling anyone who asked that it was the most valuable piece of art she owned. 6 months later, when Robert Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder and corporate espionage, Marcus was there in the courtroom, not for revenge but for closure. Blackwood had lost everything, his money, his reputation, his freedom, all because he'd underestimated a janitor who turned out to be anything but invisible. As Marcus left the courthouse, his phone rang, and it was Victoria asking if he could review some documents that had been flagged by his team as suspicious. "I'll be right there," he said, smiling because he had a job that mattered now, a purpose beyond just surviving. "And Marcus?" Victoria said before hanging up. "Thank you, again, for everything." Marcus thought about that afternoon months ago when he'd yelled, "Don't get in the car," and changed everything, and realized that sometimes being in the right place at the right time wasn't about luck but about being the kind of person who would act when action was needed. The conference room on the 35th floor had been renamed the Thompson Conference Room, a daily reminder to everyone who used it that heroes could come from anywhere, even from the night shift maintenance crew that most of them had never noticed. Marcus would sometimes stand in that room, looking at the place where he'd found those shredded documents, and marvel at how much his life had changed. Emma was thriving in her new private school, her asthma under control with the proper medication, her artistic talents being nurtured by teachers who recognized her potential. She still drew pictures of butterflies and flowers, but now she also drew pictures of her father in his suit and tie, standing tall and proud, no longer invisible but seen and valued. Victoria had become more than just his boss, she'd become a friend, someone who understood what it was like to fight for everything you had and never take it for granted. She would sometimes join Marcus and Emma for dinner, teaching Emma about business while learning from her about the simple joy of coloring outside the lines. Rodriguez had grudgingly become Marcus's mentor, teaching him about security protocols and threat assessment, but also learning from him about the power of observation and intuition. Together, they had uncovered 3 more conspiracies within the company, though none as dramatic as the first, and Morrison Enterprises had become known as one of the most secure and ethical corporations in the country. The other janitors and maintenance workers were no longer invisible either, as Marcus had instituted a program where their observations and concerns were taken seriously, with rewards for those who reported potential problems. It turned out that the people who cleaned up after others really did see things that nobody else noticed, and their input had prevented several security breaches and one case of major embezzlement. As Marcus stood in his office one year after that fateful day, looking at a photo of Emma on his desk next to a commendation from the FBI for his role in breaking up the conspiracy, he thought about how different things could have been if he'd just thrown those shredded papers away without looking at them. But that wasn't who he was, had never been who he was, even when being invisible was safer than being seen. The phone on his desk rang, and it was Victoria asking him to come to her office for an important meeting. When he arrived, he found the entire board of directors waiting, and his first thought was that something was wrong, that maybe another conspiracy had been discovered. But Victoria was smiling, and so was everyone else, and Marcus realized this wasn't about a threat but about something else entirely. "Marcus Thompson," Victoria said formally, standing at the head of the long conference table. "The board has unanimously voted to create a new position, Chief Security and Integrity Officer, reporting directly to the CEO and with a seat on the board of directors." Marcus felt his knees go weak again, just like that first day when Victoria had offered him a job on her security team. "The position comes with significant responsibilities," Victoria continued, "including overseeing all security operations, conducting integrity audits, and most importantly, ensuring that Morrison Enterprises never loses sight of the values that make us who we are." One of the board members, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile, spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, you saved this company not just from a physical threat but from a moral one as well, because if that conspiracy had succeeded, everything we've built would have been corrupted. She paused, looking around the table at her fellow board members. We need someone like you at the highest levels of leadership, someone who sees clearly and acts decisively, someone who understands that doing the right thing is always the right thing to do. Marcus accepted, of course, because how could he not when these people were offering him the chance to make a real difference, to ensure that no one in the company would ever be invisible again. As he signed the papers making him one of the highest-ranking executives at Morrison Enterprises, he thought about his father, who had died when Marcus was young but who had always told him that hard work and integrity would pay off eventually. He would be proud, Marcus whispered, and Victoria, who was standing beside him, squeezed his shoulder in understanding. That night, Marcus took Emma to her favorite restaurant to celebrate, and she listened with wide eyes as he explained his new position and what it meant for their future. So you're like a superhero now? She asked, her face serious in the way only a child's could be when discussing important matters. Marcus laughed, thinking about how he'd gone from being a janitor to an executive, from invisible to invaluable, all because he'd chosen to act when it mattered most. No, sweetheart, he said, reaching across the table to hold her hand. I'm just someone who was in the right place at the right time and did what anyone should have done. But Emma shook her head, her expression determined. No, Daddy, not everyone would have done what you did, that's what makes you special. She pulled out her coloring book and showed him her latest drawing, a figure in a gray uniform standing in front of a tall building, but this time the figure was surrounded by light, like the sun was shining just on him. That's you, she said proudly. The man who saved everyone. As they walked home, Emma's hand in his, Marcus thought about the title of the news article that had run the day after the incident. Single dad janitor yelled, "Don't get in the car." What the CEO did next shocked the whole company. It had become something of a legend at Morrison Enterprises, told to new employees as an example of how one person's courage could change everything. But for Marcus, it was simpler than that. He had seen someone in danger and had acted to help them, just as he hoped someone would act if Emma was ever in danger. The fact that it had changed his life was secondary to the fact that it had saved Victoria's life, and through that action, had saved the livelihoods of thousands of employees who would have lost their jobs if the conspiracy had succeeded. As they reached their apartment building, Emma looked up at him with a smile that reminded him so much of Sarah that it took his breath away. "Daddy, I want to be like you when I grow up," she said. "I want to help people and do the right thing even when it's scary." Marcus knelt down to her level, looking into her eyes that were so full of love and trust. "You already do that every day, Emma," he said. "Every time you share your lunch with someone who forgot theirs, every time you stand up for a classmate who's being picked on, every time you choose to be kind when you could be mean, you're doing the right thing." They went inside, and as Marcus tucked Emma into bed, she asked him to tell her the story again of how he saved the CEO. He told her, adding little details he'd left out before, like how scared he'd been and how his hands had shaken when the security guards grabbed him. "But you did it anyway," Emma said sleepily. "That's what courage is, right? Being scared but doing it anyway." Marcus kissed her forehead, marveling at the wisdom of his 9-year-old daughter. "That's exactly what courage is," he said, turning off her light and standing in the doorway for a moment, watching her drift off to sleep. Later that night, as Marcus sat in his home office reviewing security reports for the next day's board meeting, his phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Thank you again for saving my life," it read. "But more than that, thank you for reminding me why I started this company in the first place, to make a difference, to value every person, to do the right thing." Marcus smiled, typing back a simple response, "Just doing my job." But they both knew it was more than that. It was about seeing what others missed, about acting when action was needed, about understanding that everyone had value whether they were a CEO or a janitor. The next morning, as Marcus walked into Morrison Enterprises wearing his new suit and badge that gave him access to every floor, he made a point of greeting every maintenance worker he passed, knowing their names and asking about their families. They smiled back, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, part of a company that had learned the hard way that heroes could come from anywhere. In the executive elevator, Marcus thought about that day 1 year ago when he'd yelled those 5 words that changed everything: "Ma'am, don't get in the car." He thought about how Victoria Sterling had listened to a janitor she'd never met, how she trusted his warning despite having no reason to, how she transformed his act of courage into an opportunity that had changed not just his life but the culture of an entire company. As the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, Marcus saw Victoria waiting for him, holding 2 cups of coffee, one prepared exactly the way he liked it because she'd taken the time to learn such details about all her senior staff. "Ready for another day of keeping us all safe?" she asked with a smile that had become familiar over the past year. "Always," Marcus replied, taking the coffee gratefully. They walked together toward the board room where other executives were gathering, men and women who had once looked right through him but now sought his opinion on matters of security and integrity. As they entered the room, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the polished table surface and almost didn't recognize himself in the expensive suit with the confident posture of someone who belonged there. But then he saw his eyes, the same eyes that had noticed those shredded papers, the same eyes that had seen danger where others saw nothing, and he knew that underneath the executive exterior he was still Marcus Thompson, single dad and former janitor who had simply done the right thing when it mattered most. The meeting began with Victoria announcing the latest quarterly results, which were the best in the company's history, partly due to the enhanced security measures and ethical practices Marcus had implemented. "We've proven that doing business the right way is not just morally correct but also profitable," she said, looking directly at Marcus as she spoke. "We've shown that valuing every employee, from the boardroom to the maintenance room, creates a stronger, more resilient company." After the meeting, as executives filed out discussing strategies and projections, Victoria asked Marcus to stay behind. "I've been thinking about expanding your program to our subsidiaries," she said. "The idea of having observers at every level who are empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation, it could transform corporate culture across the industry." Marcus nodded, already envisioning how such a program could work, how many conspiracies and crimes cowl. The vision of expanding the program excited Marcus because he knew there were thousands of invisible workers in office buildings across the city, people who saw everything but were never heard, people who could be the eyes and ears of integrity if only someone would listen to them. "We could start with a pilot program," Marcus suggested, his mind already working through the logistics. "Bring in maintenance staff from our subsidiary companies for training, show them what to look for, create a secure reporting system where they can share concerns without fear of losing their jobs." Victoria smiled, that same warm expression she'd worn when Emma's drawing had been presented to her. "This is why I need you on the board, Marcus, because you think about the people others forget, and you understand that strength comes from every level of an organization, not just the top." As they continued discussing the expansion, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Emma's school, and his heart immediately jumped with parental worry, but the message was positive. Emma had won the school art contest with a piece titled, "My Hero, My Dad," and they wanted him to attend the award ceremony that afternoon. "Go," Victoria said, noticing his expression. "Being a father comes first, always, and besides, I'd like to come with you if that's okay because I've become quite invested in Emma's artistic journey." So that afternoon, the CEO of Morrison Enterprises and the Chief Security and Integrity Officer sat in small plastic chairs in an elementary school auditorium, watching as Emma walked onto the stage to receive her award, her face beaming with pride. When she saw them in the audience, her smile grew even wider, and she waved enthusiastically, not caring that everyone was watching. The principal read Emma's artist statement, which she had written to accompany her winning piece. "My dad used to be invisible, but he was always watching, always caring, always making sure everyone was safe even when they didn't know it, and then one day he saved someone's life and became visible, but he didn't change because he was always a hero, people just finally saw it." Marcus felt tears running down his face and didn't bother to wipe them away, and beside him, Victoria was crying too, both of them moved by the simple truth in Emma's words. After the ceremony, as they stood looking at Emma's artwork displayed on the wall, Marcus was approached by another parent, a woman in a business suit who looked familiar but whom he couldn't quite place. "Mr. Thompson," she said hesitantly. "You probably don't remember me, but you saved my husband's job last month when you uncovered that embezzlement scheme in the accounting department because he would have been blamed for his supervisor's crimes if you hadn't found the real evidence. Marcus did remember now, the case where a middle manager had been setting up a lower-level employee to take the fall for stolen funds, and how his team's investigation had revealed the truth just in time. "I'm glad we could help," he said simply, but the woman shook her head. "You don't understand," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "My husband was going to be arrested, we would have lost our house, our kids would have had to change schools, our whole life would have been destroyed, and you saved us not because it was your job but because you saw something wrong and you fixed it." She paused, looking at Emma who was showing her award to her classmates. "Your daughter is right, Mr. Thompson, you are a hero, and not just because of what you did for Ms. Sterling but because of what you do every day for people like us." As the woman walked away, Victoria put her hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You see," she said softly. "The ripples from that one moment when you yelled, 'Don't get in a car,' are still spreading, touching lives you don't even know about." Marcus thought about all the cases his team had handled in the past year, all the conspiracies uncovered, all the innocent people protected, all the guilty people caught, and realized that saving Victoria had been just the beginning of something much larger. "When I was cleaning offices," he said, "I used to imagine what it would be like to matter, to make a difference, to be someone Emma could be proud of." He looked at his daughter, surrounded by friends and teachers, all celebrating her talent and her perspective. "I never imagined it would happen because I found some trash that wasn't properly shredded." That evening, as they drove home with Emma chattering excitedly about her award and her plans for her next art project, Marcus's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pull over and take the call. "Mr. Thompson," a nervous voice said. "My name is Janet Coleman, I'm a janitor at Apex Corporation, and I heard about what you did at Morrison Enterprises, how you saved the CEO and started that program for maintenance workers." Marcus's pulse quickened because Apex was the company that had been behind the conspiracy to kill Victoria. "How can I help you, Miss Coleman?" he asked, already knowing this wasn't a casual call. "I found something," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Documents that show they're planning something else, not murder this time but something involving government contracts and bribery, and I don't know who to trust because everyone here could be involved." Marcus looked at Victoria, who had heard enough to understand what was happening, and she nodded without hesitation. "Miss Coleman, where are you right now?" Marcus asked, his mind already shifting into investigation mode. "Are you safe?" 20 minutes later, they were sitting in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city, listening as Janet Coleman, a 60-year-old grandmother who had been cleaning offices for 30 years, laid out evidence of a conspiracy that made the attempt on Victoria's life look small by comparison. "They're bribing federal officials to get defense contracts," Janet explained, showing them cell phone photos of documents she'd found. "Millions of dollars in taxpayer money going to fake projects, and they're using the profits to fund more bribes, creating a cycle that just keeps growing." Victoria was already on the phone with the FBI director, using her influence to ensure Janet's protection and to launch an immediate investigation, while Marcus reviewed the evidence with the eye of someone who had learned to see patterns in chaos. "You did the right thing coming to us," he told Janet, who looked terrified but determined. "We're going to make sure you're protected and that these people are stopped." The investigation that followed was massive, involving multiple federal agencies and resulting in the arrest of dozens of executives and government officials, but Marcus made sure Janet Coleman was recognized as the hero who had started it all, the invisible janitor who had chosen to be visible when it mattered. The media called it the janitor's revolution, the movement of maintenance workers and other overlooked employees who were standing up against corporate corruption, inspired by Marcus Thompson's example and protected by the programs he had created. Within 6 months, Marcus was testifying before Congress about the importance of protecting whistleblowers at every level of corporate hierarchy, with Emma and Victoria sitting in the gallery, watching as he explained how the people who cleaned up after others often saw the dirt that needed to be exposed. "Every person in every building has value," Marcus told the assembled senators and representatives. Every person deserves to be heard, to be protected when they speak truth to power, to be recognized as vital to the integrity of our institutions. The legislation that followed, informally known as the Thompson Act, provided unprecedented protections for corporate whistleblowers and required companies above a certain size to implement observation and reporting programs similar to what Marcus had created at Morrison Enterprises. Emma's school project that year was about the Thompson Act, and she interviewed her father about how it felt to have a law named after him. "It's not really named after me," Marcus told her as she recorded him on her tablet. "It's named after every invisible person who ever saw something wrong and wanted to make it right but was afraid to speak up because they had too much to lose." Emma tilted her head, considering this. "But you weren't afraid," she said. "You spoke up even though you could have lost everything." Marcus pulled her into a hug, thinking about that moment 2 years ago when he'd run toward Victoria's car, shouting his warning. "I was terrified," he admitted. "But I was more afraid of what would happen if I stayed silent, more afraid of living with the knowledge that I could have saved someone and didn't." As the second anniversary of the incident approached, Victoria planned a celebration at Morrison Enterprises, not just to commemorate Marcus saving her life but to celebrate all the positive changes that had followed. The maintenance staff were invited as guests of honor, wearing their uniforms with pride as they mingled with executives and board members in the same conference room where Marcus had found those fateful shredded documents. Rodriguez, who had become one of Marcus's closest friends despite their rocky start, gave a speech about how Marcus had transformed corporate security by recognizing that the best observers were often the most overlooked employees. "He taught me that strength isn't about muscle or weapons," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying across the room. "It's about seeing clearly, acting decisively, and never forgetting that every person has value." When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood at the podium looking out at the diverse crowd, maintenance workers and executives, security guards and accountants, all united in their commitment to integrity. 2 years ago, I yelled, "Don't get in the car," because I couldn't stand the thought of someone dying when I could prevent it, he began, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "I never imagined those 5 words would change my life, would change all our lives, would create a movement that's spreading across the country." He paused, finding Emma in the crowd, her face shining with pride. But the real change didn't. Growth. Victoria stood up, and soon everyone was standing, applauding not just Marcus but what he represented, the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when given the chance. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the maintenance staff returned to their shifts with a new sense of pride and purpose, Marcus found himself alone with Victoria in her office, looking out at the city lights. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found those papers?" Victoria asked, her voice contemplative. Marcus considered the question, thinking about all the different paths his life could have taken. "I try not to," he said honestly. "Because I can't imagine Emma growing up in a world where I didn't do everything I could to make it better, safer, more just." Victoria smiled, that warm expression that had become so familiar over the past 2 years. "That's why you're irreplaceable, Marcus, because you don't just see problems, you see possibilities, you don't just prevent disasters, you create opportunities for others to shine." As Marcus prepared to leave, to go home to Emma who was waiting to hear about the celebration, Victoria called out to him. "Thank you, Marcus," she said simply. "Not just for saving my life, but for saving the soul of this company, for reminding us all that heroes don't always wear capes or carry guns, sometimes they carry mop buckets and have the courage to yell, 'Don't get in the car,' when it matters most." Marcus smiled, thinking about the title of that first news article that had made him famous, "Single Dad Janitor Yelled, Don't Get in the Car." What the CEO did next shocked the whole company. It had shocked everyone when Victoria had promoted him, when she'd made him an executive, when she'd given him the power to change things. But what had really shocked the company, what had really changed everything, was the discovery that the most valuable employees might be the ones you never noticed, the ones who saw everything because they were invisible, the ones who could save your life or your company if you just gave them the chance to be heard. As Marcus drove home through the city streets, passing office buildings where janitors were just beginning their night shifts, he thought about all the potential heroes pushing their carts through empty hallways, all the observers who might one day find something important in the trash, all the invisible people who could become visible if someone just gave them the opportunity. Emma was waiting for him at the apartment, her art supplies spread across the kitchen table, working on a new drawing. "What's this one about?" Marcus asked, looking over her shoulder at the emerging image. "It's about the future," Emma said, her concentration intense as she added details. "It's about all the janitors and maintenance workers who are going to save people, just like you did, because now they know someone will listen to them." Marcus studied the drawing, seeing figures in gray uniforms standing tall beside figures in business suits, all of them working together, all of them valued equally. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, kissing the top of her head. "And you know what? I think you're right, I think that is the future." As Emma continued drawing, Marcus thought about the journey from that moment 2 years ago when he'd screamed his warning to now, when he was helping to reshape corporate culture across America. It hadn't been easy, there had been threats from those who profited from corruption, moments of doubt when he wondered if he was in over his head, times when the weight of responsibility felt crushing. But every time he wavered, he thought about Emma, about the world he wanted to leave for her, and he found the strength to continue. The next morning brought a new challenge, as Marcus's mornings often did now, with reports of suspicious activity at one of Morrison's subsidiaries in another city. But instead of sending investigators, Marcus decided to go himself, taking with him a team that included 2 former janitors who had shown exceptional observation skills in his training program. "Remember," he told them as their plane prepared to land, "we're looking for what others miss, the patterns in the chaos, the evidence that people think is trash but might be treasure." The investigation uncovered a scheme to steal intellectual property, prevented by the observations of a night shift cleaner who had noticed executives meeting after hours with competitors. Once again, an invisible person had become a hero simply by paying attention and having the courage to report what they saw. As Marcus flew back home, he received a text from Victoria, another save by the Thompson method. "The board wants to expand the program internationally." The Thompson method, as it had come to be known, was spreading beyond America, with companies around the world recognizing the value of their invisible employees. Marcus had been invited to speak at conferences in London, Tokyo, and Sydney, sharing his story and teaching others how to see what they'd been missing. But the most important audience for Marcus remained Emma, who was now 11 and beginning to understand the full impact of what her father had accomplished. She had started a club at school called The Observers, teaching her classmates to notice when someone needed help, to speak up against wrongdoing, to be brave even when they were scared. "We're all janitors in a way," she had written in her club's mission statement, words that made Marcus prouder than any corporate title ever could. "We all have the power to clean up messes, to see what others miss, to make things better if we just have the courage to act." One evening, as Marcus was reviewing security reports in his home office, Emma knocked on the door with a serious expression on her face. "Dad, there's something wrong at school," she said, and Marcus immediately gave her his full attention. "I overheard 2 teachers talking about missing money from the fundraiser, and they were blaming the parent volunteers, but I saw something else." Marcus listened as Emma explained how she'd noticed the principal's assistant taking cash from the collection boxes when she thought no one was looking, how she documented it with her phone just like Marcus had taught her, how she was scared to report it because the assistant was popular and well-liked. "What do you think I should do?" Emma asked, and Marcus saw in her eyes the same fear and determination he'd felt that day 2 years ago. "What does your gut tell you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "That if I don't say something, innocent people will be blamed and the real thief will keep stealing," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "That being scared isn't an excuse for staying silent." The next day, Marcus went with Emma to report what she'd seen, and within a week the assistant had been arrested and the parent volunteers cleared of suspicion. Emma became something of a hero at school, but she handled it with the same humility Marcus had tried to model, telling everyone that she'd just done what her dad had taught her: see clearly, act bravely, protect others. The principal, grateful for Emma's courage, implemented an observer program at the school, encouraging students to report concerns safely and anonymously, another ripple from that moment when Marcus had yelled, "Don't get in the car." As the third anniversary of the incident approached, Marcus received an unexpected call from Robert Blackwood, the former CFO who had tried to have Victoria killed. He was calling from prison, where he was serving his 20-year sentence, and his voice was different, broken and remorseful. "I've had a lot of time to think," Blackwood said, "and I wanted you to know that I understand now what you did and why you did it, and I'm sorry not just for what I tried to do but for the kind of person I'd become, someone who saw people like you as invisible, insignificant." Marcus listened without interrupting, letting the man speak his piece. "I've started a program here in prison," Blackwood continued, "teaching financial literacy to other inmates, trying to give them skills so they don't end up back here, and I named it after you, the Thompson Program, because you taught me that everyone has value, even someone like me who threw it all away." After the call, Marcus sat quietly for a long time, thinking about redemption and second chances, about how even the worst people could change if they chose to. He told Victoria about the call, and she listened with the same quiet thoughtfulness. "That's the ultimate impact of what you did," she said. "You didn't just save my life or transform our company, you showed people that change is possible, that it's never too late to start seeing others as human beings deserving of respect." Marcus thought about all the janitors and maintenance workers who had found their voices because of his example, all the corruption that had been exposed, all the lives that had been saved or improved, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction not because he'd become successful but because he'd remained true to himself through it all. The anniversary celebration was larger this time, with representatives from companies across the country that had implemented the Thompson method, with government officials who had supported the Thompson Act, with hundreds of maintenance workers who wore their uniforms like badges of honor. Emma was asked to speak, and she stood at the podium with the confidence of someone who had learned young that her voice mattered. 3 years ago, my dad was just a janitor, she began, her clear voice carrying across the packed auditorium. But he was never just anything, none of us are just anything, we're all important, we all matter, we all have the power to change the world if we're brave enough to try. She looked at Marcus, her eyes shining with tears and pride. My dad taught me that being a hero isn't about having special powers or wearing a uniform or having an important title, it's about seeing someone in danger and deciding to help, it's about finding evidence of wrongdoing and having the courage to report it, it's about remembering that every person you meet might be the one who saves your life someday. The audience erupted in applause, and Marcus felt Victoria's hand squeeze his shoulder as Emma walked off the stage and into his arms. "She's going to change the world," Victoria whispered, and Marcus nodded, knowing it was true because Emma had already started changing it just by being herself, just by seeing clearly and acting bravely, just by refusing to be invisible or to let others remain invisible. That night, as Marcus tucked Emma into bed, she asked him the question she'd never asked before, "Dad, were you ever sorry you found those papers? Did you ever wish you'd just thrown them away and kept your normal life?" Marcus sat on the edge of her bed, thinking about how to answer. "Sometimes, in the middle of the night when I can't sleep, I think about how simple life used to be," he admitted. "But then I think about all the people we've helped, all the criminals we've stopped, all the good we've been able to do, and I know I could never have lived with myself if I'd stayed silent." Emma nodded, understanding in her young way the weight of such decisions. "I'm glad you didn't stay silent," she said simply. "Not just because our life is better now, but because you showed me and everyone else that one person really can make a difference." As Marcus turned off her light and headed to his own room, he passed the framed newspaper article in the hallway, the one with the headline that had started it all, "Single Dad Janitor Yelled, Don't Get in the Car." What the CEO did next shocked the whole company. He smiled, remembering how shocked he'd been when Victoria had believed him, when she promoted him, when she'd given him the power to change not just his own life but the lives of countless others. But the real shock, he realized, was discovering that he'd had that power all along, the power to see, the power to act, the power to speak truth even when his voice shook with fear. Every janitor, every maintenance worker, every invisible person in every building had that same power, they just needed someone to remind them, someone to listen, someone to believe that their observations and their courage could change everything. And that's exactly what Marcus Thompson, former janitor and current Chief Security and Integrity Officer, intended to keep doing for the rest of his life, ensuring that no one remained invisible, that everyone had a voice, and that when someone yelled a warning, there would always be someone ready to listen.